Peglin is... Alright, look, I know that there are some of you who are already laughing based on the name, and I want you to know, I understand, I hear you, I appreciate that, but I'm going to try and not make those jokes in the first minute of this video about Peglin. Peglin is a 2022 roguelike video game by Red Nexus Games. In it, you play a Peglin, which is to say, a goblin who sees the world in terms of games of Peggle, as they go on a quest that starts in the forest, then goes to a castle, then finally deep down into the mines. In the vein of many roguelikes before it, you are presented with an aggressive flowchart you have to approach top-down, where each category gives you access to stuff. There are going to be combat encounters, out-of-context encounters, some shops to buy things in, and the usual stuff that makes up an RPG. What sets Peglin apart is its resolution mechanism, where if you're familiar at all with the general idea of an RPG, you might have it in your head to know that games like this will often have combat where you resolve things by rolling a dice. In the video game permutations on this formula, the computer can get used to implement a more complicated system. There are games where you play match 3 to resolve the combat. There are games where you have to do Picross to resolve the combat. There are games where you play pinball to resolve the combat. And in Peglin, to resolve the combat, you play Peggle. Quite frankly, any conversation around Peglin needs to look at Peggle first. And I'm only showing you footage of Peglin because I like it more and I'm having more fun playing it as I currently can with an injured arm. This is a whole conversation around accessibility in games that I just don't have the heavy lift for at the moment because, again, I've injured my arm. For those of you who aren't aware of it, Peggle is a casual puzzle game where you shoot balls from the top of a screen into a field of pegs, trying to hit a certain number of them that guarantee a victory. It's based on games like Pachinko, which you might have seen in many an anime. It first came out in 2007 and has had sequels and iterations and permutations, including Peggle Knights and Peggle World of Warcraft. Peggle has a neat little gem of an idea in its design, where you're working out shooting solutions to try and hit targets. But any shooting solution you make literally can't work a second time in the second way, because the pegs you hit disappear before you can make your second shot. It is a great little idea. It has been downloaded conservatively 50 million times and change, at least based on the numbers I had access to 5 years ago. And one of the reasons it was downloaded so much was there was a demo of it packed into the Valve Orange box, which was home to Portal, Team Fortress 2, and oh yeah, there was always meant to be more Half-Life. You probably own a copy of Peggle, and if you don't, you could sign up for an Origin account and get one for free, I bet. Peggle is everywhere. And again, this isn't about Peggle. This is about what Peggle represents. It's about how people talk about games, what games get to be considered as important, what games get to matter, and what kind of things we talk about when we talk about games. Because when we talk about games, we don't talk about Peggle. Well, unless you're Jesper Juhl. Jesper Juhl, an academic and Danish brain boy of a generally positive bent that I have spoken about in the past on this channel, is someone I think of myself as fond of. I do not think I have any academic idols or heroes, but I cannot deny the fact that when I am trying to make certain kinds of points, I do reach for Juhl to see if he's said it better first. Juhl wrote the book The Casual Revolution, and I think it's pretty good. I like it well enough, and unlike many of the other academic textbooks I've had to read, I haven't read it 30 times yet, which has dampened my feelings about quite a lot of other books. Peggle isn't one of the examples in The Casual Revolution. The chapter uses Puzzle Quest. But it still comes to mind as I write about Peggle and Peglin, where I popped the book open and found, to my surprise, that no, it was a different high-return casual game. I mixed up the two, but never felt that any of the examples I remembered from the book worked against Peggle, which says a lot, really. Chapter 3 is titled All the Games You Played Before, in which Juhl describes the success of casual games, but also the way that gamers reacted to those games. There's an interesting conversation to be had here about the idea of player logic, hat tip to Mia Consalvo, where Yule brings up the way that players treated these games as made up of other game bits, and therefore somehow lesser. The notion was that because self-styled hardcore gamers could see the way that these games worked, they weren't real games. That other games might include one of these in a different game as a kind of mini-game was seen as a way to completely delegitimize what they were, ignoring that this is still a game with a resolution mechanic, its own tensions, its own demands, and its own idea of skill. This is an argument that's still going on now, of course. We are talking about archiving games and the history of games, and that conversation is one dominated by Americans who got Nintendos when they were children, thinking that that's what happened in the rest of the world, ignoring the video game scenes of Taiwan and China and India and even just Europe. Just Europe. You know, there's a reason a lot of people liked Sonic the Hedgehog, and it wasn't just the ones who liked the weird pornography. The idea of what counts as a real game is one that I like to think I've been making fun of for pretty much as long as I've had this channel. I've been adamantly against the idea of definitional arguments, in no small part because I think definitions are hard to make and not useful when you are making them. They are a way to change the conversation away from what a person is saying to instead try and say you don't want to have that conversation in the first place. It's old, it's silly, it's bad, and it inevitably works by asserting a sort of legitimate gamer audience that has a greater position of information, a better ability to judge what a game should be than anyone else, which can often come with a certain Karen-esque, we pay your salaries, which is cute because a lot of the time, no they don't, they pay the salaries of executives who produce no meaningful value for the games they think they care about. But let's play along with their game for the moment and assume that market success is a measure of quality. When Puzzle Quest and Peggle were the hot source of contention, and when Yule was writing about this casual revolution, games journalism sources were stuck trying to explain how those games, these very successful, popular games, games that the market had decided were good, were somehow good despite their not matching the self-image of the hardcore gamer's vision of what a game should be. The book says it, quoting IGN, "Be not ashamed of your love of jewel swapping." How embarrassing is that? Not just that you could be ashamed of enjoying a mechanic, but that you might need the exhortation of an external source to do it. And it was a legitimate fear from IGN. They had to deal with people sending them rude letters and comments about how the idea of treating Peggle and Puzzle Quest as good games was a sign that they had, quote, abandoned journalistic integrity, end quote, or, quote, lost their goddamned minds, end quote. What is this all about, really, and how does it relate back to Peglin, and me only having one arm? Peggle as a system, and its whole genre of genres, is a sign of a real sickness in the culture of people who consider themselves gamers. A damaged, defensive crouch of a self-esteem across the whole identity space. A self that wants to assert that we're cool, no, it's not embarrassing to like games, we're cool now because we make money. The thing that ultimately makes this legitimate is money. And we're still not over that. We're not over not being cool. We're not over those kids with Nintendos feeling momentarily ashamed because someone at school didn't like what they liked and didn't want to talk about it in the moment where they wanted to talk about it. When I was a child, I insulted a girl at my school, and I've been thinking about that all night, tonight, in 2025, 30 years later, and wondering, I hope that didn't affect her that badly. And the thing is, that impulse is silly. And if I get the chance to talk to her about it, which I won't, my response to her being there should not be, oh, you're here, now I can absolve myself of attention I have had for many years. This is where games position us, as a sort of craven, hunkering individual, afraid of what might happen to us because we might be having fun wrong. Even as we assert that we are important to the culture, that we are the dominant force in media, that we are the landscape, that we are cool and we determine what gets made, we are still dreadfully paranoid about being embarrassing to a vision of ourselves that doesn't exist. Peggle was really good by the standards of the market. It sold exceptionally well, and it kept making profit even as its price kept dropping. And as a free game, it still pulls in people to playing games. Peggle is a conversion tool, which again, if you view video games as a marketplace where people make choices and the best choices are represented by the most people choosing them, Peggle is really important, a very impressive game. Now, this way of viewing success in games is extraordinarily silly, because this isn't a video about Peggle. This is a video about Peglin and why I'm playing Peglin. I'm playing Peglin because I'm in pain. Right now, I have soreness in my left leg and left arm that mean I can't type, which is one of the reasons why I'm doing this as an unscripted, voiced piece, which I will inevitably cringe about later on. Most of today has been spent trying to manage this pain, to try and accommodate chores in my life that I can get around to despite my current limitations, and recognize what I can do with this temporarily diminished capacity. I am, at the moment, just a little guy, and all I can do, really, is sit in a chair and read things and throw some balls at some pegs. I find Peglin in this time so comforting and so enjoyable. When I first told Fox, my partner, that I had played it, she was shocked, surprised that I had finished it in my first attempt, because she hadn't. And we had a conversation about it, during which she described difficulties she had when she played through it. And I explained that I didn't have those difficulties, and we discussed maybe there were changes to the game. This artifact of time let us share an experience across a bridge of experience where we had different experiences, but because we knew, generally speaking, the rules of the system we were interacting with, we could connect an older version of herself and a newer version of myself and see where those two people overlapped. This is something games can do. This is something games can do that is amazing. I can have conversations with people about games that we've played in common and had wildly different experiences of. And because we know the rules, generally speaking, of how those games interact, we now have a whole axis on which we can understand ourselves and one another. This is what games are for. This is the conversation around games that I find interesting. It's not treating the success and failure of companies that do not know who you are and do not care and see you as a little wallet on legs that they can milk for one purchase a year, maybe 3 DLC instances depending upon the capture we've managed to manage. Peggle was part of a revolution that we should have embraced. It was a point where we could see access of games growing wider and seeing even small parts of games that people could revel in being brought to the forefront. We are still trying to keep it out, and we are still gatekeeping. And that's why Peglin, this adorable game, is so engaging to me right now. I can't do much with all of my hands. I can't play the games that I'm excited to play. So I tried Peglin. And what I found was a delightful, thoughtful, challenging roguelite game with a combo system that actually addressed one of the big problems of deck-building roguelites. See? Yeah, I knew I was going to get around to it eventually. In most of the roguelite games I've played, especially the ones that interact with cards, there comes a problem where eventually acquisition is bad. You've probably seen my runs of Cobalt Core if you're paying attention to this channel, in which case you would know that eventually in that game, I will hit a point where I am trying to make my deck as small as possible and only cast 3 good cards repeatedly, over and over, and that's how you win the game. In this game, when you shuffle your deck, as it were, when you get your deck refreshed, the enemies get a turn. They get a free movement. So there is a tension where you want your best rocks available to throw. So you do want to have a small collection, but you don't want it so small that you're constantly giving your enemies extra turns to gang up on you. This is a tiny rules addition to Peggle. And it comes with a lot of other things. You need the movements of the enemies. You need a spatial sense. You need interactions with different types of Peg. It's very reasonable as an evolution of Peggle. This isn't a matter of like you just stumble out of Peggle one step and you find this game. Someone had to work on this. Someone's, as I understand it. But you don't get this game if you don't take Peggle seriously. Embrace more interesting games and accept that games are more interesting when we think of them as ways to understand people.